this leads us to my guest for the day, and I've been wanting to bring her on for some time now and figured this is about appropriate as it can be. So joining me now to talk about the law, vaccines, exemptions, is Dorit Rubinstein Reiss, Ph.D. Professor Reiss is a professor of law at UC Hastings College of Law in San Francisco. Dr. Reiss, welcome to the show, ma'am.
Thank you. I very much love your work.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate you saying that. Let's go ahead and start out with a little bit about you, so my audience has a feel for who I'm talking to. Now, tell us a little bit about yourself as an introduction. How did you get interested in pro-vaccination advocacy?
I got interested in this as a mom. I've been a professor of law since 2007, and I had my oldest son in 2010, and at that point I didn't even know there was an anti-vaccine movement. In 2012, I was reading a parenting blog when someone made an anti-vaccine comment, and I was surprised and started reading more. And the more I read, the more the arguments didn't make sense. And after reading The Panic Virus, a book by Stephen Hawking, I got to the conclusion that pro-vaccine parents should at least say something. So initially I planned to make some online comments and move on. And I think got a little more intense than I expected.
Yes. Yeah. Now your legal work surrounds, at least in a portion, vaccinations and the law. So can you briefly explain professionally what you do?
So, as a professor, my job has three parts. The first part is research and writing. So I write articles at this point about vaccine law and policy from different directions. I look at things like what can the legal system do to encourage vaccination or even mandate vaccination. I look at legal challenges to vaccination mandates. And I've been looking at some other questions such as what's the relationship between vaccination and equal protection, religious freedom, and so forth.
Very good. Now let's move to the topic of exemptions. This is kind of a hot topic, of course.
Yes.
And there are exemptions a parent can get to avoid getting their child vaccinated. And the first is a medical exemption. What is this exemption, and what are some examples?
So a medical exemption is something offered by every state, and I think correctly. Some people shouldn't be vaccinated for medical reasons. CDC has a list of contraindications. Some states go more broadly. For example, if someone has had a severe reaction to a previous vaccine, or if they're immune compromised, if they had a severe reaction to a previous vaccine, they shouldn't get that vaccine again. If they're immune compromised, they shouldn't get some vaccines usually. For example, live virus vaccines. And medical exemptions protect them. These are exactly the kind of people for which the rest of us should be vaccinated to offer them the protection of herd immunity.
Very good. Now, then there's the religious exemptions, and this is clearly more controversial. What religions can get this exemption? And in your view, what are the problems with the religious exemptions?
So the starting point is that asking what religion kind of assumes there's a limited number of religions that let you get out the vaccine. Our system doesn't work that way. Because we protect freedom of religion so broadly, and because we make it a point of separating state and church, our jurisprudence makes religious exemption pretty broad. You can't limit religious exemptions only to some religions or only to organized religions. You can't, even, for example, both Catholicism and Judaism generally support vaccination. But if a Jew or a Catholic claims a religious exemption and convinces officials that they have a real opposition to vaccination for religious reasons, they have to get an exemption. Our system doesn't allow you to limit exemptions to religion, and that's part of the problem. That's what makes it relatively easy for people to get a religious exemption, even if their opposition to vaccine is safety concerns and not actual religious concerns.
Right.
So there's two concerns I have about religious exemption. The first is a more principled concern. Is it fair to say, basically to parents, well, because you have a religious belief, you're allowed not to protect your child from disease and to endanger other children? It seems unfair. in a sense, it discriminates against the children of those parents who are left unprotected because of religious beliefs that they didn't choose. The other part is my concern about abuse. Because we can't limit these exemptions to organized religion or to specific religion, basically anyone who can argue that they have a religious objection and can argue it well gets that exemption. In fact, there's, for example, at least one church that was created to oppose vaccines. There's a church called the Congregation of Universal Wisdom, created by a chiropractor who has a tenet of opposing vaccination.
Huh.
And at least it's tempting to suspect that many of the parents that joined that church joined it exactly because of that opposition. So
very, very clever. Very clever.
It calls for abuse.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of brings me to this form I have in my hand. Before I came on the show, I printed up I'm in the state of Florida, of course, and the religious exemption from immunization form in Florida. And it gives you options for the child's name, date of birth, and the name of the parent or guardian. But it doesn't ask anything about what religion you are, or it doesn't ask for a minister or a priest to confirm it. Is this typical in most states? Is that how it works?
So not asking for a minister or priest is actually correct constitutional practice. You can't limit the exemption only to people who have a minister or priest confirming it. If someone has a personal religious opposition to vaccines, that's enough. Gotcha. They don't need a minister. But the other part is that not all states make it as easy as Florida. You can make the religious exemption harder to get, for example, by requiring a show of sincerity. New York has that requirement. You have to show sincerity, and that really limits the number of religious exemptions. They have less. Now, the drawback of that, the problem with that is that it kind of gives an advantage to people who either get legal representation before they submit the exemption, or who are better liars. In other words, that too can be abused, and it's also enforced by the school. So different schools have different policies. So you can make the exemption harder to get. Well, but there's no perfect way. Yeah.
Exactly. And that kind of led me to my next question. You being an expert in vaccine law, what ways can be used to prevent the abuse of religious exemptions?
So one thing is make it harder to get than just signing a form. Some states require notarization. Some states require renewing every year. New York is a classic example of requiring sincerity and having a process that really can be harder to use. There's no perfect way, but there are ways to make it harder to get a religious exemption if your opposition isn't religion. What you shouldn't do is require a confirmation by a priest or minister.
Gotcha.
That has been struck as unconstitutional in almost every state.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense, yeah. Now, are there any other exemptions out there besides medical and religious exemptions?
Yes. About 19 states now have a personal belief exemption, or a philosophical exemption, as it's sometimes called, which basically gives an exemption to anyone who asks and fills the procedural requirements.
So that's kind of like the person that doesn't want to go to war. I forgot what you call that.
Yes, the conscientious objector.
Conscientious objector, that's right. Yeah.
It's even broader than that because it doesn't require the person to justify why they are getting the exemption. Most of the time, it's just check the form that you don't want the vaccine.
Gotcha. Wow. So it is really, really simple to get out of it. Now, in your state, about 3 years ago, we saw the reasonably large measles outbreak linked to Disneyland in California. And this, of course, prompted legislation in your state that abolished the personal belief exemption. Yes. And tell me if I'm wrong, okay?
Okay. No, you're right.
Okay. Now, this is a law that you were pretty intimately involved in. Can I first have you define something called informed consent? Because I think that was one of the problems with it, if I'm not wrong, if I'm incorrect. And then could you discuss the law and what happened in California? Because it did go through the legislature and it did get signed by the governor, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's start with your question about informed consent. Informed consent means that a doctor can't give a treatment without providing the person getting the treatment with the information about the treatment, including the risks and the alternatives, and without getting their consent. It's not exactly in conflict with vaccine mandates, and here's why. The doctors in California still can't give a vaccine to a child without the parent's consent, and without the parent's consent after getting information. There's a federal law that requires giving parents certain materials before vaccinating. That's still in place. Informed consent doesn't mean there aren't any consequences to not getting the treatment. I'll give you one example.
Sure.
I'll give you actually two examples. First, all states have some limit on the ability of people with epilepsy to drive without taking, say, seizure medicine. In some states, you can't get a license unless you're taking the medication, unless the seizures are controlled. That doesn't mean that you're forced to take the medication. You still have to consent to take the medication, but there might be consequences if you choose not to. Another example is that quarantine requirements sometimes allow you. So in some states, if you have tuberculosis, you can choose between getting certain treatment and being quarantined. Mm-hmm. So you can choose not to get the treatment. Nobody's going to hold you down and force them on you.
Sure.
But there are going to be consequences. When we talk about school mandates as well.
Exactly.
The parent has to agree with the vaccine. But if they don't, there might be consequences. The consequences being limiting the ability of the child to go to school.
Gotcha. So can you tell us a little bit about what happened in California in 2015, I believe it was?
Yeah, so I'm going to back up a little and remind you that in 2012, California tightened its immunization requirement by adding an education requirement that the doctor signed that the person got an explanation of the benefits and risks of vaccine before getting an exemption. The person who headed that was Dr. Richard Pan. In 2015, a number of parents called Dr. Pan after the outbreak, and he and Senator Ben Allen decided to go forward with abolishing the personal belief exemption completely. I admit that at the time it was a bit of a surprise to at least me. It wasn't expected, but they went ahead. The proposed legislation went through 4 legislative committees. Usually, the proposal goes through 1, at most 2 committees in the House and 1 or most 2 in the Senate, depending where it starts. In this case, the proposal went through 3 committees in the Senate, a very deliberative process, and then went through also the Health Committee in the House, and passed with a majority, a bipartisan majority in both houses, and was signed by the governor. So it's a very lengthy, deliberative process with a strong opposition from the anti-vaccine minority. And it ended with a statute that abolished the personal belief exemption. It also grandfathered many of the children that already had exemption. Basically, it says you can't have an exemption if you reach a checkpoint. A checkpoint being entering daycare, entering kindergarten, or entering 7th grade.
Right.
But in between, if you're, let's say, a 2nd grader when the law comes in, you can rely on your exemption until 7th grade. If you're an 8th grader, you can rely on your exemption until you graduate. And it also limited the applicability of the law to children with disabilities that had individual education plans. So it made a big difference. It abolished the personal belief exemption, but it was also it also included some real exceptions in appropriate situations.
Now, just based on your participation in this California law, I obviously take it that you are for compulsory vaccinations for children before starting school.
I have a somewhat strange position on that. My ideal situation would be having a personal belief exemption that's extremely hard to get. That would let the extreme 1% get out, but be very hard to get so that there won't be an explosion of exemptions.
I see.
But I kind of suspect that that's impractical.
I just don't see something like that happening. It would be great because I'm sure people do have legitimate reasons. I'm not sure exactly what they would be, but now, so what do you say to critics that call compulsory vaccination laws a form of discrimination or a form of segregation?
Yeah, from my point of view, that's a misguided argument. Discrimination means treating like cases differently. Vaccine-deprived children are not in the same situation as children who are vaccinated, who have been protected against disease. Through no fault of their own, they're left at risk of disease. And through no fault of their own, when there's a lot of them, they bring a risk of outbreak to the school. It's not discrimination to treat children who are really objectively differently. In fact, it's kind of the norm. It's like saying not letting a kid who brought a knife to school in is discrimination. No, it's not. This is a different scenario. Also, to remind you, most cases of discrimination, though not all, are based on immutable characteristics or characteristics that are so fundamental that people shouldn't have to forgo them,
sure,
such as religion or race. This isn't the case here. This is a choice. Choices do have consequences. We don't discriminate when we give tickets to people who jaywalk. We're not discriminating when we say parents who choose not to vaccinate can't send the child to school and risk others. You made a choice. There are consequences.
Okay, I'm talking to Professor Dorit Rubinstein Reiss from UC Hastings College of Law. And my next question is about a study that I stumbled across recently. It was in the journal Pediatrics, and I wanted to get your viewpoint on this. I thought it was kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. And the authors looked at exemptions a little bit differently. They suggested that only the measles vaccine should be restricted from non-medical vaccine exemptions because of its extreme contagiousness. I don't know if you're familiar with the study,
I am.
Dr. Reiss. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm very sympathetic to the author's frustration. The authors are from a state that tried to pass an exemption law and it failed. They're trying to suggest a way to improve rates in their state without running into the same problems, without having it dead on arrival. I think their approach is misguided, and here's why. First of all, their argument is measles is extremely contagious, and it's a different case. And they're right that it's extremely contagious, but it's not clear that that means that it's a different enough case to give up on other diseases. Diphtheria isn't as contagious, but has a 10% mortality. So giving up on diseases that are less contagious but more dangerous might not be a good idea. More important, I think they're not going to get the practical result that they think. First of all, there's going to be a strong opposition to a law that only abolishes non-medical exemptions for measles. There was very strong opposition to laws that just added educational requirements. I don't think they'll have an easier time passing such a law. And second, I think it won't be easier to enforce. From the point of view of a school nurse, if she has to check that a child got the measles vaccine, she might as well check the others. Mm. It's not going to be easier to enforce. So I think the intent is great. The proposal won't work as the way they think.
Yeah, I kind of felt the same way, but I did find it really interesting, just, the angle they were coming from.
Yeah.
I got about 3 minutes left till the break. Mm-hmm. I did go over I looked at some of your writings, and some of them were pretty interesting, and I would imagine some people probably consider some of these controversial.
Yes.
Now, in one of them, you say that, Dr. Reiss, as we get closer to running out of time, I'm going to go ahead and stop you, and we'll hold on to the second half, if that's okay with you. Okay, perfect.
That's great.
You say that parents who don't vaccinate their children should be held liable if they transmit the infection to another child. And you say that you believe that the other child's parents have the right to be compensated due to negligence. Now, how would that work? Would that have to be something that's hashed out in a courtroom, or?
Yes, there's a number of legal questions that the court will have to decide, including whether such a case can go forward, because our system is very careful with claims for non-action. Usually you don't have a duty to act for the benefit of others. So that should be the first obstacle. And there's also going to be practical questions that depend on the case. For example, you'll have to show that the non-vaccination caused the harm. There's answers to all of that, but it really will depend on the case.
Now, the other one, okay, I got about 2 minutes left, but I mean, if you have a lot to say, that's okay. We can pick it up in the second half. Mm-hmm. It's another paper in which you were a co-author, and you and your colleagues proposed the creation of a no-fault fund paid by parents who refuse to vaccinate their children. And essentially that would be money used to pay for public health work on, fighting outbreaks and all that. Can you explain your proposal in a little bit more detail?
Yes, I'll start at least and stop me when you need to go. So the starting point for this is that outbreaks cost a lot of money, and they cost money that public health can spend on other things, such as helping children with disabilities and other important causes. Parents who don't vaccinate are making a choice that, in a sense, imposes costs on others, including the public. And the proposal is aimed at two things. First, to make sure that they pay the cost of their action rather than the public paying for it, that they internalize the cost. And second, hopefully, at least as a potential deterrent, to make these parents rethink whether this is really worth it, whether the risk is worth not vaccinating. And costs seem to do that, at least in part. Our paper covered a number of ways to do that.
So will this kind of work? This would kind of work like raising taxes on cigarettes. Is that the kind of principle you're looking at?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Go ahead. Well, Dr. Reiss, I'm getting really close to the break. Can you hold that thought, and
yes,
I'll bring you back on. All right. And I want to encourage the audience, check out the website, outbreaknewstoday.com, outbreaknewstoday.com. And I encourage you also to sign up for the weekly newsletter. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out, but I encourage you to check it out, because it's going to be something new that's coming around the bend at the website. And after the break, we'll be talking more about vaccines and law with Professor Dorit Rubinstein Reiss.
Welcome back to Outbreak News This Week, your source for all the news about worms and germs. Here's your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, welcome back to the program. I have a very special guest on today. It's Professor Dorit Rubinstein Reiss, professor of law at UC Hastings College of Law in San Francisco. And in the first half, we were going over a whole bunch of different topics concerning exemptions and vaccines, and we left off with Dr. Reiss discussing a paper that she co-authored in which they proposed the creation of a no-fault fund paid by parents who refuse to vaccinate their kids, and it would pay for public health departments and all that to help them fight outbreaks. And Dr. Reiss, you're free to continue, ma'am.
Yes, I am. Thank you. So where we stopped was discussing how it would work, and we looked at two different ways. One way is having parents who don't vaccinate pay in advance, and you can do that by a tax or a fee on all parents who don't vaccinate. The other way is having parents who don't vaccinate get a bill if they did actually cause an outbreak, and in that case, only the parents that were involved in the outbreak would get the bill, and it's going to be a pretty big bill. So these are two very different ways, but we think that either of them could have a good impact, both on the cost of outbreak, which can run in the millions, and on the behavior of parents, or at least the considerations of parents who think about not vaccinating. To remind you, if we look at the California outbreak, it was limited to relatively few cases because of the hard work of public health, which was to quarantine and supervise the cases that came up. It could have been a lot larger, and the bill was in the millions.
Sure. Now, let me ask you a question. I imagine that the anti-vaccination crowd, when they saw some of these papers that you were authored or co-authored, were they vocal? Did you face any vocal backlash from them?
Well, naturally. It's natural for them to feel threatened with some of these ideas. Nobody likes to think that they're going to have to pay for choices that they consider legitimate. So, yes, there was some backlash.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's not surprising. But, okay, well, this is a topic that I see all the time, and I really don't know a whole lot about it, and I would imagine my audience doesn't either. And I would like to get a nice explanation of what is the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act and the corresponding National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, and what are their purposes? Because I hear a lot of people that criticize this.
Yes, so the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Act was passed in the late 1980s, but the idea of a no-fault compensation for vaccine injuries was around for a while. There's two issues here. One, from the point of view of manufacturers, vaccine lawsuits, whether they win or lose, are costly, and the profits from vaccines aren't that high. So if there's a number of lawsuits, even if they win all of them, it's just not worth it. In the 1980s, manufacturers were leaving the market because of an increase in lawsuits. On the other hand, in terms of law, these are pretty hard claims to prove. If you look at countries that don't have a no-fault system, such as Canada, Australia, it's very hard to win a vaccine injury case there. So consumer organizations were also unhappy. For example, the National Vaccine Information Center, which is one of our larger anti-vaccine organizations, also supported the act on condition that it will give plaintiffs, people claiming a vaccine injury, certain breaks. And the result was a compromise that nobody was super happy with, but I think that worked reasonably well. The National Vaccine Injury Childhood Act did a number of things. One thing is, as you said, it created a no-fault program for those claiming vaccine injuries. What does that mean? It means that they, unlike the courts, they don't have to show that the vaccine was defective, a product defect. They just have to show that the vaccine caused a harm and that they should show what the damages are. And even for showing that the vaccine caused a harm, they get some breaks. One break is that some injuries are on a table of injuries. If you're on the table, for example, if you had an allergic reaction within hours of the vaccine, you don't have to show the vaccine caused anything. There's a presumption the vaccine caused this harm. Today, most cases aren't on the table because it's out of date. It's being updated, but it's still out of date. But even if your claim is not on the table, showing causation in vaccine court is easier than in the regular court because the court decided that you don't have to show that the scientific literature supports you. If you have an expert and a plausible theory, you might win. Now, if the scientific literature is against you, you might not. But you don't have to show, unlike regular courts, that the scientific literature supports you. That's a big break.
Yeah.
So the no-fault program gives plaintiffs important breaks. It also covers the lawyer's fee. It does, however, limit their ability to go directly to court. And in some cases, in one kind of cases, what we call design defect, the Supreme Court decided that you can't go to regular court at all, that vaccine court is your only option. Now, just to be clear, if you lose in vaccine court, you can appeal to the Court of Federal Claims, then to the Circuit Court, then to the Supreme Court. You're not dependent only on the program. There is an appeal. But there's still limits on your ability to go to the regular court.
Gotcha. Well, that cleared it up quite a bit for me. Thank you. Now, during my readings, I see a lot of, I look at what the anti-vaccine crowd. I like to read what they have to say too, and a lot of times, they're pointing out, all these horrible things with the HPV vaccine and MMR and all that. And my question is, what is the truth, as you know it, concerning the adverse events and the cause and effect of injuries. I mean, are they just shooting off at the mouth? And are we? I mean, what is the truth?
So first of all, I'm not a doctor.
Yes.
I'll give you my best opinion, but
Yeah.
this is a question that you're better off asking an expert. Second, my best understanding is that first, they're not just shooting their mouth; they're saying what they think. That said, what they think often goes against the evidence. There's been a number of There's a lot of studies of vaccine safety. Everybody cares about vaccine safety. I mean, I vaccinate my children. Of course. I want vaccines to be safe. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I wouldn't want to vaccinate them. But there's tens of thousands of studies of vaccine safety, and they all seem to show more or less the same thing. Bad things can happen from vaccines, just as bad things can happen from anything, from walking down the street, from eating spinach. There's always a risk. But bad things from vaccines are very, very rare. And from HPV, for example, the evidence is that it's an extremely safe vaccine. I haven't seen evidence of any deaths actually caused by it, and it seems that at least the studies we have show that the main thing it causes are local reactions and fainting on the day off or nearby. So I think my reading is that vaccines can cause bad things. It's extremely rare, and the risks of not vaccinating are much bigger.
Right, and that kind of leads into my final question. I really appreciate you being here. As you pointed out, you're not a physician. However, you are a mom, and you do have a great deal of knowledge about vaccines for a layperson. So, what would, if you don't mind, what would you tell a parent who was contemplating not vaccinating their kids for whatever reason?
Well, I'd start by saying that it's totally natural not to want needles anywhere near your child. I mean, I keep hoping they'd come up with a better way to protect our kids from disease. Who wants needles near their child? That said, there's a lot of risks in the world we can't protect our children from. Preventable diseases are one thing we can protect them from. Vaccine safety is something that's studied all over the world from all directions. And it's one of the things we have the best evidence of. When you're choosing not to vaccinate, you're choosing the bigger risk for your child. I love my children. I want to protect them. And vaccinating is the best way to protect them. I hope other parents do the same and protect their children. Children deserve protection from preventable disease.
Very good. Very good and very wise. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Dorit Rubinstein Reiss, for your time and expertise, ma'am. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Okay, so